Okay, I would like to tell you some things, which is I work for the City Council for 36 years now. And when I began to work in a park in the city, which is the Monsanto Park. And it's very peculiar because this city is a very small city. It is only 600,000 inhabitants, although the big city is about 2.5 million. So the question is that this park, which formerly was a peri-urban park, for some people is nowadays considered an urban park, although it cannot, because it has 1,000 hectares in a city, and the city is just 8,800 hectares. So it's nearly 1/8 of the city. And since I'm a technician, I have a different scope of the one which I have been hearing here. So I hope this is not going to confuse you. Okay, so the question is that once you work with politicians, because I work with politicians, with decisioners, you need to arrange the information you give the politician in order for them to take the right decision. So you are decision maker, helpful. But sometimes the information is not that easy for a decisioner to take it, especially if it doesn't bring any money, if it doesn't bring any votes, or something like this. So it's quite difficult to make things go on. So I divided my presentation here on these 5 points. And I think the main point is that we were able to turn into real, one thing which is a local action plan for biodiversity in Lisbon for 2020. So this is really what I find more important here for my experience to be useful to you. So starting an idea, I would begin by saying that usually these kind of events are taken by general people as doesn't matter anything. So they are not useful. And for us they were, because they were like an alarm clock saying what is happening to biodiversity in the world, what are you going to develop in terms of biodiversity in the city, and you have a full year to think about, and afterwards it was decided to state a decade for biodiversity. And happily for me, I don't hear too much about this decade all around the world. So let's state that it is important for us to do something on what it concerns biodiversity. The second thing which is important is that we are not really worried only on the strictest sense of biodiversity, but we are worried with the question of biodiversity as an indicator of quality of the environment and of quality of the living. So if you speak a word like this, and if you speak, for example, for a politician, that if you want to make your city competitive among other cities, and your city has a better quality of the environment, that is important. That is a word which is important. So I think this is an important issue. The other issue is that when we started to think about biodiversity in Lisbon, I could tell you, for example, that we have around 3,000 species of trees in 8,800 hectares. Just because we were the main people from the discoveries and we brought trees from all over the world. So we have collections and collections of plants in botanic gardens. So this biodiversity is really important. And afterwards, there is another thing, which is we are in the middle of I think it's this one, yes. We are in the middle of two main areas of fauna, which is the Euroasiatic platform and the Africa. So we have animals which come from Africa, which come from the Arctic, and we have our special animals which just live in the Iberian Peninsula. And we even have migrators which pass through the Iberian Peninsula. So we have a biodiversity which, in terms of the biodiversity in Europe, it has more or less 80% of all the biodiversity in Europe. So we have this biodiversity issue is also a value. And this value can be attractive, for example, for tourists. We have tourists coming from Europe to visit the biodiversity in Portugal and in Lisbon. So we wanted to turn this into a project, and first of all, we tried to define correctly what was the starting point. So we tried to state what is our beginning, because if we don't know our beginning, we are not going to be able to check whether our intervention, our work, is being useful or not. So we defined a CBI. This CBI was some CBIs were already developed both for Singapore, for Curitiba in Brazil, and other countries. And we found out that they were not applicable to Lisbon. So one thing which is important is that the CBI we stated, it's just a CBI for Lisbon. We are not intending to compare the data we collect from Lisbon with other cities. We are prepared to compare our cities in the beginning, in our CBI in the beginning and in the end of the application of the plan. So this is a performance index, which is quite important for us. And we also defined that there was not so important to have more species, but to have a good quality of the services which were coming from the ecosystems we are trying to develop. And we were worried also about the way that the politicians managed the biodiversity issues in the city. So we defined this index with many variables. I'm not going to explain you all, but I would say that, for example, the percentage of natural areas and so on, and areas which seemed like natural in the city allowed us to state this. This is the park where I work in, this one, and we found out that the only nature was in the shore of the river. This is the River Tagus here, and these are other cities around Lisbon. So as you see, if you have a city here, nowadays our park is nearly in the middle of the city. But the question is that we didn't have too much nature, but we have lots of places where we worked for the naturalization of the site. For example, the park where I work with, it was beginning to be forested in 1934. And nowadays, people come there to visit it because they think it's a national park. Because we introduced the forest, the trees, and afterwards there was a response from the ecosystem with the development both of the natural regeneration and of the fauna that should live there. And so nowadays the ecosystem feels as completed. It functions as if it was a full ecosystem, a full naturalized ecosystem. So one of the things that we could do is to establish other areas and work in the same way. Another example, for example, we were worried about the connectivity of the ecosystems, and we found out that it was different to define this if it was on the soil or if it was on the canopy, because we had lots of trees in the city, trees in the middle of the avenue, for example. And for birds, it's enough to have a way to jump from one tree to the other. So this is the soil level, and this is the canopy level. So if you think about the canopy, you can see that Lisbon is really a city with lots of trees and lots of plants and animals. We found out that there were 23 types of different ecosystems. And we studied them, and we defined these 23 different ecosystems in the city. But afterwards, we found out that this information was meaningfulness, because it was so accurate. It was made first by an approach with the satellite information, and then checked in the floor, in the field, to check what was the ecosystem which was in each place. But this was unuseful. So we decided that this was not the approach which was needed. We just needed to have an approach which aggregated some ecosystem in order to have a definition not of a flora cover, but as an ecosystem with flora and fauna. For example, the amount of orchards and agriculture, urban agriculture in the city. We found out that in 1987 we had all these areas, and in 2006 we had only this one. So this was a need to improve an agriculture which was near to the people, especially because there was a knowledge which was being lost. The quantity, the amount of protected areas in the city, we found out that there were very few. So we needed to establish protected areas in small portions that could be working as a network that could have an area enough to have, for example, the nesting of certain animals, especially birds. And we were also concerned of having an institutional capacity to have a strategy and a local action plan and so on. So we are worried with the governance and the development of the biodiversity in the management of the city. So we established a strong objective, 20% of improvement till 2020, beginning in 2012. And we are not only worried with the number of species, as I told you, but of course we found out that once we are developing more and more studies, more knowledge we gain, and really we are improving the number of species, not because they are coming from for the city, but because we are now knowing of their existence. So probably in 2020 we will speak about a success. So we define a strategy. The strategy is online. You can access to it, but it is also written in a book. And we collected the information about the ecosystem in a very raw data, because we wanted to have the information in a way that could be worked out by different institutions and operators at different levels, at different depths, and they could build afterwards their own tailor-made maps. For example, the information we got showed us that we needed to improve some corridors, and these corridors should have some rules established about the growth of the buildings in certain areas, so that we could find corridors between green areas and the green areas and the river. So this is the kind of built information after the raw data. So we set a local action plan, and the local action plan was based on a strategy which was defined by three main axes. The sensibilization to act, the build knowledge useful to act, and the action. The question was that many university institutions were building knowledge which was not directly used in practical ways. And what we wanted was to have good partnerships between us and the university, so that this information could be useful immediately. And the institutions liked it. So the plan. Well, this is going to be a little bit a staff work to read, but I'm going to leave this, and I think afterwards you are going to spread the PowerPoint. But I would say that, for example, the fundraising was a flop. because of the crisis, we didn't find any fundraise in Portugal, as you know. We began to train people about things, develop studies, set and monitor biodiversity hotspots, monitor species and habitats, create platforms to collect data, edit supporting materials, setting trails, celebrate and organize events, diminishing the car speed and improving the slow mobility, renaturalize some areas by even thinking about rewilding some areas or promoting biodiversity at least, improve the landscapes in gardens and parks, special attention to watersheds and their contribution to floods, following a water cycle approach. This is a language that the politicians understand very well, the question of safety and risks. This is not a question of votes or money. This is something they hear because they are afraid if something happens. So this is a good approach to get the influence to the decision makers. Improve the green spaces, the corridors, and between gardens and parks. And you would say, well, this is theory. This is not the practical. It is the practical, and I'm going to show it to you. This is what the politicians made. Our councillor decided that because of the existence of this park, we should establish continuity between all the green areas and the river. And nowadays, all these corridors are being built. So this is not a theory. This is what it happened really. And I can show you, for example, this is the orchards. We improved in 500% the number of urban agriculture allotments. And this was a success. What we already reached, I could say that we have already some trails. We have disseminated our work. We have organized many investments on materials which were edited. For example, this is one exhibition of Musi and Likani, but the question is to develop the way of the people look at nature. Usually they look at trees, and we want them to see that the nature worked from each of its components. For example, this is a project which is now beginning, which is an investment of about 5 million euros. And this was taken by the City Council to lower the speed of the cars in the parks and to improve a network of trails in the parks and in the between parks in the city. The corridors I talked to you about, this is the corridor which has already been built, which is called Corridor Oriental. It's Corridor Quinta da Montanha. And this one is going to be beginning next 6 months, which is the corridor of the Valley of Alcântara. So this is still in project, but it's going to be built. We improved NBS solutions, and we created even a new way of looking at biodiversity in the city, which is the ZIBs, which are areas with importance for biodiversity. And we build bridges, we build shelters, we even put nets around some places in order to protect them. Of course, we even established a strategy for the adaptation of climate changes. We are working with rules and manuals of good practices for many scopes in the city. I'm thinking too long. And these are some examples of activities we have been developing. I hope that you enjoyed this. We like very much when we have an activity with people. We have a center for the recovery of animals which are injured, and generally when we have these kind of meetings, afterwards we get one into free again because they are treated and they are sent to freedom again. So I didn't bring the animal, I just bring the picture. Okay, so if you need anything, please ask.
Thank inspiring to me.
Okay.
Did you have any
Questions?
I do have. So when you value ecological connectivity, how you did it? Which indicators you use or which methods? So you value the structural connectivity or you value the functional connectivity?
Well, we designed 4 layers of connectivity. The first layer is on the soil. The second one is for passeriform. The third one is from 5 meters high to 30 meters high, and the other for rapaces and so on. So by these means, we made a map of the city where you could find a small bird, or a blackbird, or an eagle. Every local authority in the low level, they wanted to have everything. So if they want, they must work for it. So we just make the recommendations that if you want to have fauna in your local authority, you must do this and this and this. This is a manual of good practices. We have meetings periodically with the local authorities in the lower level, and we try them to influence them in order to have these. I think it's better for you if you have, for example, if you live in a city where you have in your window a nest of a falcotinunculus, which is a harrier, and some people do in Lisbon.
A follow-up question, so you focus your connectivity analysis on birds?
No, because in the lower level, the soil, it's mammals and also water animals. Because, for example, in the big areas, we are building small ponds in order to have areas for having the nesting of insects, and the nesting of insects is going to attract both bats and insective animals and amphibious. So we are working in all these 4 levels, okay? And especially by recommendation. We are not obliging anybody to do anything. But if you have, for example, I showed you some brochures. I think I cannot come back. No. There are some brochures which says that if you want to have in your garden a bat, you should do this. If you want to have butterflies, you should do that. And so on. So if you have a trail in your place which allows you to see birds and mammals and amphibians and so on, my neighbor wants to. It's like this.
I think the valuation happened in that event, that they said, let's add value to this and come up with a plan. The value was when you guys all decided to start doing something and recognize the value.
And the city considers it a priority. And so this is very important because you begin to hear about it. And once you begin to hear about it, I began to see people building, for example, feeders for birds in their windows. We just explain how to do it.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Just, move on.